The air in the community hall was thick and warm, smelling of floor polish, old paper programs, and the faint, sweet scent of baby powder from a toddler fidgeting a few rows away. It was a noise that never stopped, a constant hum of excitement and nerves. Little girls in sparkly dresses practiced their twirls, their patent leather shoes squeaking on the worn wooden floor. A boy with a serious face blew into a trumpet, producing a sound like a startled elephant, making a few grown-ups chuckle. But for one little girl, Anzu, none of it felt real. It was like she was watching a movie about a party she never wanted to attend. She sat on a hard metal folding chair, its coldness seeping through the thin fabric of her new dress. The dress was itchy. It was a pale blue, the color of the sad sky, and the lace collar felt like a tiny, scratchy spiderweb against her neck. She kept her small hands balled into fists in her lap, digging her fingernails into her palms, just to feel something other than the scratchy lace and the knot that was tightening in her stomach. Her legs, too short to reach the floor, swung back and forth, the heels of her shiny black shoes tapping softly against the chair's legs. Tap, tap, tap. It was the only sound she could control in this room full of noise. Beside her, her father sat like a statue. He was a man who seemed to be made of straight lines and sharp angles. His back was perfectly straight, his shoulders were square, and his face, when he wasn't speaking, was a mask of serious thought. He looked at his watch, a heavy silver one that glinted under the overhead lights. A soft click as he pressed the button. He looked at the program in his hand, then back at his watch. Another click. He had done this 3 times already. Ansu didn't need to look at him to know. She could feel the rhythmic, impatient energy coming off him in waves. He was a man who believed in order, in time, in discipline. He had signed her up for this, for the annual Children's Talent Showcase. He had said it would be good for her. "It builds character, Anzu-chan," he had told her at home, his voice leaving no room for argument. A person must face what they fear. But she didn't fear the piano. She just didn't like it. To her, it was a big, black box with too many teeth. The white teeth were the easy ones, the ones that sang out a clear, simple song. But the black teeth were tricky. They were quiet and mysterious, and they always seemed to be hiding secrets she couldn't figure out. When her father made her practice, she would sit on the bench, her feet dangling just like they were now, and her fingers would play the notes. But her mind would be somewhere else. It would be in the garden, chasing a butterfly, or in her room, arranging her tiny wooden animals in a perfect line. The music her fingers made was just noise, a task to be finished, like brushing her teeth or eating her vegetables. It had no life in it. Her mother, Naomi, was on her other side. She was the opposite of her father. She was soft and warm, and she smelled like the jasmine tea she always drank. She reached over now and put her hand on Anzu's shoulder. Her touch was gentle, but Anzu could feel the slight tremble in her fingers. Anzu looked up at her. Her mother was trying to smile, but her eyes were full of worry. It was the kind of smile that said, "I am so sorry, my love. Please just get through this." She quietly smoothed a piece of Ansu's dark hair behind her ear, her fingers lingering for a second. "It will be all right," she whispered, so softly that Anzu could barely hear her over the hum of the room. But Anzu knew her mother wasn't just talking about the performance. She was talking about everything. About the pressure, about the long practice sessions, about the way her father's face would tighten when she played a wrong note. Anzu leaned into her mother's side for a moment, trying to soak in the warmth and kindness before it was gone. Her father cleared his throat. A low, rumbling sound that broke the small bubble of comfort she had found. "Sit up straight, Anzu," he said, his voice low and firm. "You represent the family." Anzu immediately pulled away from her mother and sat up, her back as straight as she could make it. The spiderweb lace on her collar seemed to tighten, and the knot in her stomach pulled itself into an even tighter, harder ball. She looked out at the stage. At the center of it, under the bright, hot lights, sat the piano. It wasn't just a big, black box anymore. From here, it looked like a giant sleeping creature. Its lid was propped open like a mouth waiting to yawn. The keys, all in their perfect rows, looked like 100 little eyes staring right at her. It was waiting for her, and she felt a tiny tremor of fear. Maybe she did fear it, just a little. The announcer, a man with a very friendly voice that didn't match the serious feeling in the room, stepped up to the microphone. He said a few thank yous and made a joke that most of the adults laughed at. Anzu didn't listen. She was too busy watching a little girl with a big bow in her hair finish her dance. The girl curtsied, and the room filled with loud, clapping applause. Everyone was smiling. The girl's parents were beaming, waving from their seats. Anzu imagined what it would feel like to make everyone happy like that. She imagined her father smiling a real, warm smile, not his straight-line smile. She imagined her mother looking relieved and proud. But the image felt impossible, like trying to catch a cloud. Then, the friendly voice from the microphone spoke again, and this time, the words seemed to cut right through the noise and land directly in her heart. "And now, for our next performance," the man said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet that had fallen over the room. "We have a very young performer. Please welcome, for her very first time on this stage, 6-year-old Ansu, playing a beautiful piece on the piano. Her name." It hung in the air for a second. Ansu felt her breath catch in her throat. All the noise, all the people, everything in the room seemed to disappear. There was only the sound of her own heart beating fast, like a little bird trapped in her chest. This was it. The moment her father had been preparing her for. The moment her mother had been worrying about. The walk to the monster. She felt her father's presence beside her, solid and unmovable. He didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. He just leaned down, and she felt a firm, steady pressure between her shoulder blades. It wasn't a hard push. It was just a nudge. A guiding, impossible-to-ignore nudge that told her in no uncertain terms that it was time. The nudge from her father's hand was not hard, but it felt like a strong wind pushing a small boat away from the shore. Ansu felt her legs unfold from under the chair. Her feet, which had been tapping nervously, now found the sticky, polished floor. For a moment she was frozen, her eyes locked on the worn wooden planks leading to the stage. She could see the scuff marks from countless shoes, the faint lines where the floorboards met. It was a long road. The longest road she had ever had to walk. Behind her, she could feel the weight of her father's stare. It wasn't a mean stare, but it was heavy, full of expectations that were too big for a 6-year-old to carry. She could also feel her mother's worry, like a soft, sad cloud. The announcer's friendly voice had faded away, and now there was a different kind of sound in the room. It was the sound of 200 people all turning their heads at once, the soft rustle of program pages, the quiet shift of bodies and seats. They were all looking at her. A small wave of whispers started, like leaves skittering across pavement. "Oh, look at her, she's so tiny. Is that her? The little one? Poor thing, she looks terrified." Each whisper felt like a tiny pinprick on her skin. She started to move, one foot in front of the other. Her new black shoes, which her mother had polished until they shone like mirrors, felt clumsy and big. She was a slow-motion movie, the entire world watching her make the long, lonely journey from the darkness of the audience to the bright, scary light of the stage. The distance was only about 20 yards, but it felt like a mile. With every step, the lights grew brighter, hotter. They made the world go fuzzy around the edges. The faces of the people in the front rows became blurry paintings, their expressions soft and unclear. She could hear the soft, padded thud of her own feet. Thud, 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 thud. It was the only sound she could focus on. She tried not to look at the piano, the big black beast waiting for her. She kept her eyes on the floor, on the path she had to walk. She thought about the ants in the garden, how they march in a straight line, one after the other, without ever looking up. She tried to be an ant, just marching, marching, marching. As she reached the steps leading up to the stage, her foot nearly missed the low wooden step. She stumbled, her arms flying out for a moment to catch her balance. A soft, collective gasp came from the audience. A few people stood up thinking she was going to fall. Her father's hand shot out from his seat, as if to catch her from across the room, but then he stopped himself, letting it fall back to his side. Ansu's face burned with heat. For a second, she wanted to turn and run back to her mother, to bury her face in her soft dress and forget all about this. But the steps were right there. The stage was right there. She took a deep, shaky breath and climbed the 3 small steps. Now she was on the stage. The floor here was different, rougher under her shoes. The world was gone. There was no audience, no parents, no whispers. There was only her and the piano. And the light. The light was so bright she could feel it on her eyelids. It made her feel like she was standing on the sun. The piano sat in the center of it all, looking even bigger and more serious up close. It wasn't a monster now. It was more like a wise old king sitting on its throne, waiting to see if she was worthy. Its black wood gleamed, reflecting the stage lights like a dark pool of water. She could see her own tiny, distorted reflection in the shiny surface, a small, pale girl in a scratchy blue dress, her hair a little messy. She had to get onto the bench. The bench was a long, dark wooden plank, and it looked higher than a fence. She was too small to just sit down gracefully like the big kids did. She had to climb. First, she put one knee on the edge of the bench, her hand pressing down on the smooth wood to hold herself up. Then she swung her other leg over. It was not a graceful movement. It was clumsy and awkward. As she struggled to get her whole body onto the seat, a few soft, sympathetic sighs and ahs drifted up from the audience. They weren't making fun of her. They were feeling sorry for her. Anzu felt a pang of shame. She didn't want their pity. She wanted to be invisible. Finally, she was seated. Her feet dangled high above the floor, swinging gently, far away from the 3 brass pedals below. They looked like shiny buttons she could never reach. She adjusted herself on the bench, wiggling until she was in the middle. The polished wood was cool against her legs. She stared at the keys in front of her. So many of them. A whole city of black and white buildings stretching out to the left and the right. Her piece of music was sitting on the stand above the keys, but she didn't need to look at it. She knew the notes. Her father had made her practice it every single day for the last month. She could play it in her sleep, with her eyes closed, with her hands tied behind her back. It was a simple, quiet song, a folk tune her grandmother used to hum. It was pretty, but it was empty. It was just a collection of sounds. She sat there for a long moment, her hands resting in her lap, just staring. The silence in the hall was complete. It was a heavy, expectant silence. Everyone was waiting. The judges were holding their pens. The parents were leaning forward. Her mother was probably holding her breath. Her father was watching, his face unreadable from this distance. She could feel all of their hopes and fears and curiosities pressing down on her. She felt like a single blade of grass trying to hold up a giant boulder. She lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. Her fingers felt small and white against the ivory. They trembled slightly. She positioned her right thumb over the first note, the one her father had called C, a simple white key. She could feel the cool, smooth plastic under her skin. She could feel the tiny weight of the hammer inside the piano, just waiting for her to press down. She closed her eyes for a second. She thought of her mother's gentle hand on her shoulder, her jasmine tea smell. She thought of her father's straight back and his watch. She thought of the long walk. She thought of the pitying sighs. She thought of everything that had brought her to this exact moment. She took one last, deep breath, filling her lungs with the hot, bright air of the stage, and then she began to play. The first note Anzu pressed down was not a mistake, but it was not right. It was the correct note, the one her father had called C, but it came out sounding shy and a little shaky, like a mouse peeking out of its hole. It hung in the silent air for a second, all alone and nervous. In the audience, a few people shifted in their seats. A mother gently patted her son's arm. They had all heard this sound before. It was the sound of a small, scared child trying to do something big. It was the sound of a beginning. It was the sound they expected. Ansu's fingers, which had felt like stiff little sticks, moved to the next few notes. She was playing the song her grandmother used to hum. The notes followed one after another, just as they were supposed to. They were clean and they were in tune, but they were empty. It was just a string of sounds like beads on a necklace with no clasp. Her mind was just going through the motions like a robot following a command. Press this key. Now this one. Now this one. She could feel the familiar wooden hardness of the bench under her, the heat of the lights on her hair. She was a little girl on a big stage playing a little song. Nothing more, but then something strange happened. As her fingers moved to play a part of the song that she particularly liked, a small, quiet memory popped into her head. It was a memory of her grandmother not humming but sitting with her on the porch swing. Her grandmother's hands were wrinkly and soft, and they always smelled of fresh bread. In the memory, her grandmother was telling her a story about a little bird that had lost its family and was flying all alone, searching for its home. The story was sad, but also a little bit hopeful. Ansu didn't even realize she was thinking of it. The memory just floated up like a bubble in water, and as it did, her finger, which was about to play the next simple note, did something different. It paused for just a tiny second, a breath of a pause. And then, instead of playing the note the way it was written on the page, it pressed down a little harder and then a little softer, making the note sound like a small, quiet question. The note was no longer just a bead on a string. It was a word. Anzu didn't notice the change at first. Her fingers kept moving, but now they seemed to be listening to a new voice inside her, a voice she didn't know she had. The song was still the same. The notes were mostly the same, but the space between the notes was different. It was like she had found a secret door in the music. She started to add things. They were small things, tiny changes that no one else would probably notice. She would play two notes together, a soft, quiet harmony that made the simple melody sound like it was wrapped in a warm blanket. She would hold a note just a little longer than she was supposed to, letting its sound fill up the empty spaces of the hall, making everyone wait, making them listen. Her body, which had been stiff and straight, began to relax. Her shoulders, which had been up by her ears, slowly lowered. Her back, which had been so straight it felt like it might break, curved just a little over the keyboard. Her eyes, which had been fixed on her own hands, slowly drifted closed. She was no longer seeing the keys. She was no longer seeing the bright lights or the blurry faces of the crowd. She was inside the music. She was no longer just playing the song. She was telling the story. The story she was telling was not the happy folk tune from the paper. It was a much older and deeper story. It was the story of the little bird her grandmother had told her about. It was the story of feeling small and lost in a big, noisy world. It was the story of feeling itchy in a scratchy dress and wanting to hide. It was the story of a father who was hard and a mother who was worried and the space in between. The music coming from the piano was no longer just pretty. It was full of a sad, beautiful ache. It had a loneliness in it that made a few people in the audience feel a sudden lump in their own throats. She was improvising now, not even thinking about the notes on the page. Her fingers seemed to know where to go. They moved with a new confidence, a new purpose. They danced and whispered across the keys. Sometimes the music would become soft and tentative, like the little bird peeking out of its hole again. Other times it would swell into a bigger, stronger sound. A cry of sadness that was so powerful it felt like it was pulling all the air out of the room. It was the sound of a child who had been pushed too hard, a child who had never been asked how she felt. And now, without using any words, she was telling them. Her father, Kenji, was sitting perfectly still in his chair, his program lying forgotten on his lap. He had come here expecting to see discipline. He had come to see his daughter fulfill a duty. He had wanted to see her sit up straight, play the notes correctly, and take a polite bow. But what he was hearing was something he had no name for. He saw his daughter's small body hunched over the piano, her eyes closed, and he did not see a child being forced to do a task. He saw someone pouring her entire soul out into the world. The hard, straight lines of his own face began to soften. The man who believed in order and time was hearing a sound that was completely outside of both. It was messy, and it was raw, and it was true. For the first time, he looked at his little girl and saw not a project, but a person. The music began to slow down. The big, sad cries became softer again, turning into quiet, gentle whispers. The little bird was getting tired. It was finding a place to rest for the night. Ansu's fingers moved more slowly now, savoring each note as if it were the last one they would ever play. The melody was simple again, like it was at the beginning, but it was different. It was no longer empty. It was full of all the feelings it had just felt. It was a quiet piece at the end of a long journey. And then her fingers found the very last note. It was a low, soft C. She pressed it down, holding it, letting its deep, quiet sound fill the hall. She held it, until the sound was just a memory, a faint vibration in the air. And then she lifted her hands from the keys and let them fall into her lap. The silence that followed was not the same as the silence that had come before. The first silence was full of waiting. This silence was full of listening. Everyone in the room was still holding the last note in their hearts, completely speechless. The last note of the piano didn't just disappear. It seemed to float in the air, getting softer and softer, like a tiny feather carried away on a gentle breeze. When it was finally gone, it left something behind. It left a silence. But this was not a normal silence. It was a heavy, thick silence, a blanket made of sound that had just been there. In the community hall, no one moved. No one coughed. No one rustled their program. It was as if the entire room, all 200 people, were holding their breath, trying to keep that last, beautiful sound from escaping completely. Ansu sat on the piano bench, her hands resting in her lap. She slowly opened her eyes. For a second, she felt a little dizzy, like she had just woken up from a long dream. The bright lights of the stage seemed harsh and sudden after being closed for so long. She blinked, looking down at her hands. They looked the same as they always did, small and pale, but they felt different. They felt warm and tingly, as if they had just been holding something very precious. She looked up at the audience, and the world came rushing back in. But it was a different world than the one she had walked into a few minutes ago. The faces were not just blurry paintings anymore. They were sharp and clear. And they were all looking at her, but not in the way they had looked before. There was no pity in their eyes now. There was no impatience. Ansu saw a woman in the front row with a little boy on her lap, and the woman had tears running down her cheeks, but she was smiling. A man a few rows back had taken his glasses off and was rubbing his eyes with his thumb and forefinger. A young girl, maybe a teenager, had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a kind of quiet shock. The silence was not empty. It was full of their feelings. It was full of awe. In the third row, a grandmotherly-looking woman with silver hair and a kind face reached into her purse and pulled out a tissue. She dabbed gently at the corner of her eye. The little boy on her mother's lap was completely still, not fidgeting anymore. He was just staring at the small girl on the stage, his mouth slightly open, as if he were seeing a magic trick. The whispers that had started when Ansu walked to the stage had completely vanished. No one had words for what they had just heard, and then there was her father, Kenji. He was still in his seat, his body perfectly straight, but something inside him had broken. The straight-line mask of his face was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. His mouth was slightly open, his brow furrowed not in anger, but in deep, complete confusion and wonder. He had come here to watch his daughter perform a task. He had wanted to see her be strong, to face her fear. But he had not been prepared for this. He had not been prepared for the raw, heartbreaking truth that had just poured out of that piano. For the first time, he was not thinking about discipline or character. He was thinking about the quiet little girl who sat at his dinner table, who rarely spoke, who he had never truly listened to. He felt a sharp, painful feeling in his chest, a feeling that was a lot like regret. He had pushed her toward the piano, but he had never once thought to ask her what she might have to say. Next to him, Naomi, Ansu's mother, had one hand pressed against her heart. Her other hand was covering her mouth, but a small, happy-sad sob escaped. Tears were flowing freely down her face, but these were not the worried tears from before. These were tears of relief, of pride, of a mother's heart breaking and healing all at the same time. She had seen the struggle, she had felt the pressure, and now she was seeing the release. She was seeing the beautiful, fragile spirit of her daughter, finally allowed to fly, even if just for a few minutes. Her smile was a mess of tears and joy. The silence stretched on. It was so long that it started to become awkward. People began to look at each other, as if to ask, "Did you hear what I heard? Was that real?" They were all waiting for someone to make the first move, to break the spell that the music had cast over the room. It was like they were all afraid that, if they made a sound, the memory of what they just heard would disappear forever. The silence was a tribute, a shared, sacred moment of listening. Finally, an old man sitting in the very back row, a man who had probably heard 1,000 songs in his long life, slowly raised his hand. He brought it down on his knee with a single, loud clap. The sound was like a crack of thunder in the quiet hall. It was the signal everyone had been waiting for. That one clap was the spark that lit the fire. Suddenly the room exploded. It wasn't a polite, gentle clapping. It was a roar. It was a wave of sound so powerful it felt like it could push you backwards. One by one, and then all at once, the audience rose to their feet. The thunder of applause filled the hall, shaking the very floorboards. People were shouting, "Bravo!" and "Amazing!" They were clapping so hard their palms must have been stinging. The tears on the woman's face were now joined by a huge, bright smile. The teenage girl was still staring, but now she was clapping too. A look of pure inspiration on her face. The sound washed over Anzu, who was still sitting on the bench, looking completely stunned. Her eyes were wide. She had never heard a sound like this. She had never seen so many people standing for her. A deep, rosy blush spread across her cheeks. She didn't understand. She had just played the piano. She had just let her fingers do what they wanted. Why were they all making so much noise? She saw her father and mother on their feet, clapping with everyone else. Her father was clapping harder than anyone, his face turned up toward her, an expression of pure, unadulterated awe and pride on his face. It was a look she had never seen before. Anzu's heart did a little flip. She managed a small, clumsy wave, and then, remembering her manners, she slid off the bench, her feet thumping softly on the stage floor. She turned to the audience and gave a wobbly, awkward bow, her hair falling over her face. The applause just got louder. She quickly scurried off the stage, the sound following her like a warm, loving blanket as she disappeared into the wings. A little girl who had gone to the piano as one person and was coming back as someone else entirely. The loud, wonderful noise of the clapping followed Ansu like a warm wind as she hurried off the side of the stage. The world backstage was dark and quiet after the bright lights and the roaring crowd. Her feet made soft padding sounds on the rough concrete floor. She didn't stop until she was safely hidden behind a thick, dark velvet curtain. She leaned against the wall, her heart still beating fast, but in a different way now. It wasn't the scared, trapped beating from before. It was a fast, happy beat like a drum celebrating. She could still hear the applause, a muffled, rumbling sound like a distant train. It was for her. The thought was so big and strange that she had to sit down on a small wooden crate. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. Resting her chin on her knees, the scratchy lace on her collar didn't bother her anymore. The tight knot in her stomach was gone. In its place was a light, bubbly feeling, like she had swallowed a handful of sparkling soda pop. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to remember the feeling of playing. It was like a dream. She hadn't been thinking about the notes or about making a mistake. She had just been feeling, and her fingers had translated those feelings into music. It was the strangest, most wonderful secret she had ever had. The muffled roar of the applause finally began to die down. She heard the announcer's friendly voice again, saying something wonderful about the amazing young musician, and then she heard him introduce the next act. The spell was broken. The show had to go on. A few seconds later, her mother, Naomi, came hurrying around the curtain. Her face was still wet with tears, but she was smiling the biggest smile Anzu had ever seen. She didn't say a word. She just rushed forward and knelt down, wrapping Anzu in a hug so tight and warm it felt like a safe, cozy blanket. Anzu buried her face in her mother's shoulder, smelling the familiar, comforting scent of jasmine tea and happiness. "Oh, my sweet girl," her mother whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She pulled back just enough to look at Anzu's face, her hands cupping her cheeks. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." She didn't say, "You were great," or "You played well." She said, "It was beautiful." She was talking about the music, not just the performance. And in that moment, Anzu felt like her mother truly understood. She leaned in and gave her mother a kiss on the cheek, a small, shy "thank you for everything." A moment later, her father appeared. His walk was different. It wasn't his usual stiff, straight walk. He looked a little unsure of himself, like he was walking on ground that had suddenly become soft and uneven. He stopped in front of Anzu, who was still sitting on the crate. He looked down at her, his face a mixture of about 100 different feelings at once. Awe, pride, confusion, and a little bit of shame. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The man who always knew what to say, who always had a lesson or a command, was speechless. He finally knelt down, a slow, careful movement, so his face was level with hers. He looked at her, really looked at her for a long time. He saw not just his daughter, but the person who had poured her heart out on that stage. "Anzu," he said, and his voice was not firm or loud. It was soft, a little shaky. He paused, looking for the right words. "I had no idea." He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. He just looked at her, and Anzu saw something new in his eyes. It was respect. He reached out and, very gently, placed his hand on top of her head. It wasn't a pat of command. It was a slow, soft stroke, full of a tenderness she had never felt from him before. That small touch meant more than any applause. Later, after all the other children had finished their performances, it was time for the awards. The judges came back on stage looking serious. They announced the winners for the different age groups. Anzu didn't win first prize for her age group. That went to a boy who played a very fast, very complicated piece with no mistakes. Anzu clapped for him. He was very good. But when the head judge, a woman with a kind face and silver hair, stepped up to the microphone, she said she had one more award to give. "Sometimes," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet hall, "we see a performance that is not about technique. It's not about playing all the right notes. It's about touching the human heart. It's about reminding us all why we have music in the first place." She looked out into the crowd, her eyes finding Anzu and her parents in the front row. Tonight, a young musician did exactly that. Her performance left us all speechless. Therefore, we have created a special award for artistic impression and profound emotional expression. We would like to invite Anzu to the stage. The crowd erupted again, even louder this time. Anzu's mother squeezed her hand. Her father gave her a small, encouraging nod. This time, when Anzu walked to the stage, she didn't feel scared. The walk didn't feel long. She felt the warmth of the people's smiles on her back. The stage lights didn't feel hot. They felt like a spotlight for something special. She climbed onto the bench all by herself, and the judge gave her a small, shiny plaque. It didn't look like a trophy. It looked important. That day changed everything, and yet it changed nothing at all. The trophy for the special award sat on a shelf in their living room, a quiet reminder of the day the world held its breath for her. But the real change was quieter. The pressure to practice was gone. The stern commands to sit up straight and play it again were never heard again. The piano was no longer a task, a chore, a black beast. It became a friend. Anzu would often go to the piano on her own without anyone telling her to. She would sit on the bench, her feet dangling, and she would play. She didn't just play the sad song anymore. She played happy songs, curious songs, and funny songs. She played her feelings. She would tell stories about the sun, about her cat, about the funny face a boy made at school. The music that filled their home was no longer a noise. It was a conversation. Her father would sometimes stop what he was doing and just stand in the doorway, listening. A soft smile would play on his lips. He had pushed his daughter to the piano, thinking he was teaching her discipline. But he had learned a much bigger lesson. He had learned that the best things in life can't be pushed or forced. They have to be set free. And that day, his little girl, pushed to the piano, found not just her voice, but a new beginning for all of them, one beautiful, honest note at a time.